There is a particular kind of silence that arrives after you stop doing the work no one ever asked you to do out loud. It is not the silence of rest, it is not the silence of peace, it is something stranger, something that presses against the edges of your nervous system in a way you cannot quite name at first. You notice it in small moments. The phone that used to vibrate with someone else's crisis now sits still on the table. And instead of relief, you feel a faint disorientation, as if a room you had been standing in for 30 years has just lost its walls. You walk through your own home and realize you are not listening for anyone. You are not scanning the atmosphere. You are not tracking a mood that is not yours. And in that absence, something begins to surface that you have never actually met before. Yourself, unaccompanied. This is the threshold most people describe incorrectly when they describe awakening. They speak of light, of expansion, of some bright arrival. What actually occurs is quieter and far more unsettling. You simply stop performing an invisible job you were hired for before you could speak, and the world around you, which was organized around your performance of that job, begins to tremble. Not your world, theirs. The people who loved you in the particular way they were capable of loving you begin to sense, somewhere beneath their awareness, that the emotional labor they had come to rely on is no longer flowing outward from you toward them. They cannot name it, they will not name it, but they feel it, and what they feel, almost immediately, is not gratitude for your wholeness, it is destabilization, sometimes dressed as concern, sometimes dressed as anger, sometimes dressed as a sudden, pointed question about whether you have changed, whether something is wrong, whether you are all right, whether you have become, as they might phrase it, a little different lately. You have, but not in the way they suspect. What has changed is not your personality, it is the direction of a current that has been running through you, invisibly, since you were very small, somewhere in the early architecture of your life, in a household whose emotional weather was not safe to ignore. You learned to do something that most children in more stable households never had to learn. You learned to read the room before you entered it. You learned to locate the mood of the adult who held the power in that room, and you learned to adjust yourself silently, precisely, in whatever way would keep that mood from collapsing into something dangerous. If your mother was sad, you became bright. If your father was volatile, you became small. If one parent was unwell and the other was absent, you became older than your years, competent, watchful, useful. You did not decide to do this. No one decided it with you. It simply happened. The way a plant decides which direction to grow based on where the light is, except the light, in your case, was survival, and the growth was crooked. This is the first thing to understand, and it will take the rest of this conversation to understand it properly. You were not born into the role you have spent your life performing. You were shaped into it by a specific psychological transaction, one that operates far below conscious awareness in most families, and one that has a name, though the name is less important than the recognition of what it does. Somewhere in the first few years of your life, an unspoken agreement was formed between you and the people who were supposed to care for you. The agreement, in its rawest form, went something like this: I will stay emotionally regulated for you. I will carry what you cannot carry. I will be the stable one, the bright one, the quiet one, the understanding one, the strong one. Whatever configuration this particular family requires, and in exchange you will not abandon me. You will not collapse. You will not leave me alone in a world I cannot yet navigate. The terms of the agreement were never written down because the agreement was never conscious, but you signed it in the only currency a small child has, which is the surrender of your own emotional interior. You traded the right to have your own feelings, your own responses, your own inconvenient needs, for the promise that if you were good enough at managing theirs, you would be allowed to stay, and you were. You were allowed to stay. That is the unbearable part. It worked. The system you built inside yourself, the watchfulness, the preemptive adjustment, the ability to feel another person's state before they felt it themselves, kept you attached to people who might otherwise have let you slip away. It was a brilliant adaptation. It saved you. And now, decades later, it is the exact structure that is breaking under its own weight, because the thing you built to survive childhood cannot sustain an adult life. It was never designed to. It was designed to keep a small child alive in a home that was not safe. And it has continued to run unconsciously long after the danger passed, long after you grew up, long after you acquired the capacity to protect yourself in ways a child cannot. What you are feeling now, this strange silence after you finally stop carrying what is not yours, is the sound of that old adaptation going offline. It is not peace yet. It is closer to the hum of a machine that has been running in the background of your life for so long that you only notice it once it stops. And for a while, that stopping does not feel like freedom. It feels like a kind of absence you do not know what to do with. The nervous system, after all, does not distinguish between safety and familiarity. It treats what is familiar as safe and what is unfamiliar as threatening, even when the unfamiliar thing is your own sovereignty. This is why people, when they first begin to stop absorbing the emotional content of their families, often report feeling not liberated, but strange, hollow, cold, sometimes guilty for no reason they can identify, vaguely unwell in a way that has no medical explanation. These are not signs that something has gone wrong. They are signs that something has finally stopped going wrong, and your psyche is trying to recalibrate around an equilibrium it has never known. Consider what it looks like from the outside, because this is where the recognition begins to land. Your mother calls. She has called to tell you again about the sister who is not doing well, the brother who does not visit, the neighbor who has disappointed her, the small grievances that make up the terrain of her days. For most of your life, when these calls came, you would feel a subtle clench somewhere in your body, a gathering of yourself into the shape required for the next 40 minutes. You would listen, you would reflect, you would offer the small, strategic affirmations that kept her stabilized. You would hang up the phone drained in a way you could not explain, and you would tell yourself that this was love, that this was what daughters or sons did, that this was simply the price of being a good person in a family. Now imagine that one day, without deciding to, you pick up the phone and something in you does not gather, something in you listens without absorbing. You hear her words, but they do not enter the place in you where they used to take up residence and quietly rearrange the furniture. You respond kindly. You are not cold, but the current has reversed. She is speaking into you, and nothing is coming back the way it used to. And by the end of the call, something in her voice has shifted. She may say, "I don't know what's wrong with you lately." She may say, "You seem distant." She may say, "I just needed to talk to someone." Or she may say nothing at all, but you will feel the disturbance traveling through the line like a small electrical charge, and after you hang up, you will sit with a peculiar guilt of having done nothing wrong. That guilt, that particular guilt, is the most important sensation in this entire process. It is not the guilt of having harmed someone. It is the guilt of having stopped performing an unconscious service. These are not the same. The mind, however, cannot always tell them apart at first, because for most of your life, these two things were fused. To withhold a service was to harm. To stop carrying the other person's emotion was to abandon them. This is the equation that was written into you before you could question it. And dismantling that equation is not a single act, but a slow, patient excavation. Because every time the current tries to reverse itself, the old equation activates and tells you that you have done something monstrous. You have not. You have simply stopped doing something that was never yours to do in the first place. But to see this clearly, you have to understand what was happening beneath the surface of that early bargain, because the bargain was not really about your mother or your father as individuals. It was about a structure in your psyche that formed around them, a structure that has continued to shape every significant relationship you have entered since. The figures who troubled your childhood do not remain outside you. They migrate inward. They become part of the internal cast of characters that populates your unconscious, and they continue to exert their influence long after the actual people have aged, weakened, or died. This is what is meant, in the oldest psychological language available, by a complex, not a mood, not a quirk. A complex is an organized cluster of feelings, is image, and reactions that operates beneath your conscious control, and it forms around the unresolved emotional material of your earliest significant relationships. When that material was centered on a mother who could not meet you, you carry a mother complex. When it was centered on a father who was absent, cruel, unpredictable, or merely unreachable, you carry a father complex, and these complexes do not sit quietly in a corner of your mind. They animate, they cast themselves outward onto the people you meet. and they arrange your relationships in such a way that the original wound has the opportunity again and again to present itself for resolution. This is why you have found yourself, perhaps more than once, in relationships with people who resemble in temperament or pattern, if not in surface detail, the figure who first injured you. It is not bad luck. It is not a failure of judgment. It is the unerring precision of a psyche that is attempting, through repetition, to complete what was left incomplete. The complex reaches out through you and selects from the available pool of possible partners, friends, and employers the one whose emotional architecture will allow the original pattern to replay, and you enter the pattern because, at some level beneath words, the pattern is familiar, and familiarity, to the nervous system, reads as home, even when home was not safe, especially when home was not safe, because the nervous system did not learn what safety feels like, it learned what home feels like. And it has spent your adult life reproducing that feeling under the mistaken belief that it is searching for love. What you are beginning to do now, in the silence that has arrived, is something that breaks this cycle at the root. You are no longer allowing the complex to reach outward and organize your relationships around its needs. You are feeling the pull of the old familiarity and choosing quietly not to follow it. And the people around you, the ones who were often unconsciously chosen by that complex to play its assigned roles, are beginning to sense that the script has changed. They will not understand why. They will not know that they were ever playing a role. They will only feel that something between you and them has shifted, and they will respond to that shift in the way most humans respond to any disturbance in a familiar emotional atmosphere. They will try to restore it, sometimes through affection, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through a sudden crisis that requires your attention. And you, for the first time, will be able to feel the restoration attempt as it happens. And you will have the terrible and beautiful option of not responding to it the way you always have. To see why their attempts to restore the old atmosphere feel so strangely coordinated, so uncannily timed. You have to understand something about what you were doing for them all along, something neither you nor they ever had language for. You were not simply being kind, you were not simply being a good son, a good daughter, a good partner, a good friend. You were functioning, without knowing it, as an external regulator for emotional material they could not hold inside themselves. Every family, every intimate system contains a certain amount of unprocessed feeling, grief that was never mourned, rage that was never permitted, shame that was never spoken, fear that had no safe place to land. In a healthy system, these feelings move through the people who originally held them, are metabolized over time, and eventually settle into something livable. In an unhealthy system, they do not move. They accumulate, and because unprocessed emotion does not disappear simply because it is denied, the system has to do something with it. What it does, almost invariably, is locate the most sensitive, the most attuned, the most emotionally porous member, and it begins to route the excess material through that person. That person was you. You did not agree to this. You did not even know it was happening. But from a very early age, you became the place where the family's unspoken feelings went to be processed. Your mother's disappointment, which she could not admit even to herself, found its way into your body as a chronic low-grade anxiety. Your father's unacknowledged grief, which he buried beneath work or silence or irritation, became your own unexplained heaviness, the weight you carried without being able to identify its source, your siblings' unmet rage, which could not be expressed directly, filtered through you as the inexplicable tension you felt whenever that sibling entered the room. You metabolized what they could not metabolize, and in doing so, you allowed them to remain stable. You were the organ through which the family's toxic emotional byproducts were filtered. This is not a metaphor. This is the actual functional role you played, and it is the role your nervous system was trained to perform before you had any capacity to refuse it. When you stop performing this role, the emotional material that was being filtered through you stops being filtered. It does not disappear. It returns to the people who originally held it, and they, for the first time in possibly many years, are forced to feel what they have not been feeling. They do not experience this as the return of their own unprocessed emotion. They experience it as a vague, unpleasant disturbance that seems to be connected to you. They sense that something between you and them has changed. And because they cannot see the actual mechanism, they reach for the nearest available explanation. You are being selfish. You are being cold. You are under the influence of some new friend, some new book, some new idea that has turned you against them. You are going through a phase. You have become someone they do not recognize. What they are actually saying, in the only language available to them, is that they can feel the feelings you used to carry for them, and those feelings are intolerable, and they would like you to go back to carrying them, please, as soon as possible. This is the moment in which most people who begin to awaken collapse back into the old pattern. The pressure is enormous, and it does not feel like pressure from outside. It feels like pressure from inside, because the old arrangement is etched into your own nervous system as deeply as it is etched into theirs. When they destabilize, something in you destabilizes with them, and the reflex to restore the atmosphere, to smooth, to reassure, to once again take up the emotional labor, rises in you like a wave that has crested 1,000 times before. You will feel in these moments that you are a bad person. You will feel that you have become cruel. You will feel that you are watching someone you love suffer, and that you have the power to end their suffering, and that by choosing not to, you are committing a kind of quiet violence against them. None of this is true. All of it will feel true. And the distance between the feeling of its truth and the fact of its untruth is the exact territory you now have to learn to stand in without moving. Consider what is actually happening. Structurally, when this pressure arises, Your mother, let us sigh, calls, and her voice carries that particular note, the one that used to activate you instantly, the small tremor of unspoken need wrapped in ordinary conversation. In the old arrangement, that note would travel into you, and some part of you, trained since childhood, would rise to meet it. You would ask the right question, you would offer the right reassurance, you would listen in the particular way that allowed her to feel held without ever having to ask to be held. And after the call, you would be tired in a way you could not explain, because you had just performed an invisible act of emotional transfer. You had taken something from her and placed it inside yourself. And she had walked away lighter, and you had walked away heavier, and neither of you had any idea that this was what had happened. You called it love. She called it being close, but it was not love. Love does not require that one person be emptied so the other can be filled. Love is the meeting of two people who can each hold themselves. What was passing between you was something else, something older, something that belonged to a time when you were small and she was the center of your universe, and her emotional state was literally the difference between your survival and your collapse. That time has ended. Your body has not yet been informed. When you begin to hear that note in her voice and not rise to meet it, what you experience is not calm. What you experience is a specific, physical, almost unbearable tension, because every cell in the old structure is screaming that you must respond, that something catastrophic will happen if you do not, that she will break, that she will leave you, that she will die, that the world will end. None of those things will happen. They never were going to happen. They were the terrors of a 4-year-old child who had no other way to understand the stakes of her disappointment. And those terrors became encoded in you as the emotional truth of the situation. When you stay still in the face of that note now, when you listen without rising, when you remain warm but do not take on the transfer, what you are actually doing is letting the 4-year-old inside you discover in real time that the catastrophe she has feared her entire life does not, in fact, occur. Your mother does not die. Your mother does not even suffer particularly. She is briefly uncomfortable. She adjusts. Sometimes she becomes irritable. Sometimes she finds someone else to speak to. Sometimes she surprises you by meeting you in a new way, because the removal of your emotional caretaking has created a space in which she can, perhaps for the first time, who be seen as she actually is rather than as the role your unconscious assigned her. But none of this is possible while you are still entangled in the father complex or the mother complex that has been running your intimate life from underneath. And here the language must become more precise, because these terms have been so softened by popular usage that they have almost lost their meaning. A mother complex is not a bad relationship with your mother. A father complex is not unresolved daddy issues. These are imprecise and faintly mocking phrases that allow you to keep the material at arm's length. The thing itself is much closer to you than that. A mother complex, in the exact sense, is a configuration of your inner life in which the figure of the mother, internalized long before you could discriminate between her actual qualities and your projections onto her, continues to exert formative influence on your feelings, your choices, your attractions, and your recoils. You do not have a relationship with your mother only in the external world. You have a relationship with a mother who lives inside you. And that internal mother is a composite of your actual mother, your longings, your fears, and the archetypal mother who is vast and impersonal and far older than any individual woman. When that internal mother was wounded, when her actual human counterpart could not meet the needs of the child you were, the complex that forms around the wound takes on a life of its own. It does not simply sit there as a painful memory. It becomes an active force. It shapes what you notice in other women, what you do not notice, what you tolerate, what you cannot tolerate, whom you find yourself drawn to, whom you flee from. If the wound involved a mother who was emotionally absent, your complex will cause you, again and again, to select partners or friends whose emotional absence feels eerily familiar, and you will experience the familiarity as chemistry, as connection, as a sense that you have known this person before. You have, in a sense, you have known her since before you could speak. She is the face of your complex wearing a new body. And until you recognize this, you will continue to mistake the activation of old wounds for the arrival of love. The same is true of the father complex, with its own particular flavor. If your father was unpredictable, you will find yourself drawn, beneath your conscious preferences, to the kind of man or woman whose unpredictability stirs in you a mixture of longing and dread that feels, to your confused nervous system, like passion. If your father was absent, the absences in your later relationships will register as deeply meaningful rather than as warnings. If your father was overwhelming, critical, or domineering, you will find yourself entangled with people who carry a trace of that overwhelming quality, and you will interpret their overwhelming presence as strength, as substance, as seriousness. When it is none of those things, the complex does not select for your well-being, it selects for its own continuation. It is not your enemy. It is not even malicious. It is simply a psychological structure that has not yet been brought into consciousness. And structures that have not been brought into consciousness tend to repeat themselves until they are. This is the mechanism behind what you may have noticed about your own life, the strange recurrence of similar figures in different costumes, the feeling that you have somehow ended up once again in a dynamic that resembles the one you swore you had left behind. You did not end up there by accident. You were carried there by a part of you that has not yet been permitted to become conscious. And that part of you will continue to carry you there until it is met, examined, and gradually relieved of its position as the hidden navigator of your life. Meeting it is not a matter of insight alone. It is not enough to know intellectually that you have a mother complex. Many people know this and continue to live out its dictates as if they had never heard the term. Meeting it requires something slower, something that resembles what happens when a long hidden member of a household finally sits down at the dinner table with the rest of the family. You do not eliminate the complex, you do not defeat it, you simply allow it to become visible, and visibility in psychological matters is the beginning of the end of a pattern's unconscious power. What becomes visible, once you allow it to, is something that may at first seem impossible to accept. The people to whom your complex has bound you are not, in the main, bad people. They are not villains. They are not predators in any dramatic sense. They are, most often, themselves the carriers of their own unresolved material, and they found in you a person whose particular wound fitted theirs like two pieces of a broken vessel that have not yet been reassembled into anything whole. The mother who could not meet you was herself unmet. The father who could not see you was himself unseen. The partner who cannot hold you is himself or herself unheld. This does not excuse what happened. It does not soften the real consequences that have lived in your body for decades, but it does dissolve the illusion that you were trapped by anyone's deliberate cruelty. You were caught in a pattern that preceded you and will outlast you unless someone, somewhere in the chain, becomes conscious enough to stop transmitting it. That is what you are being asked now to do, not as a moral heroism, not as a sacrifice, not as a spiritual achievement, simply as the next necessary step in a life that has arrived at the point where the old arrangements can no longer hold, because they are structurally unsound and you have quietly grown too weighted, too whole, too aware to continue pretending that they can. The pretending was never freely chosen. It was what was available to you for most of your life. The capacity to stop pretending, which is now beginning to emerge, is not a gift or a special endowment. It is the ordinary result of a psyche that has been paying attention for long enough and has finally reached the point at which paying attention becomes action, without your having to decide that it should. And yet, the ending of pretending is not experienced as relief. At first, it is experienced as exposure, because you have built, over many years, an entire social and relational architecture on the foundation of the role you were playing. Friends who loved the version of you who was always available, family members who relied on the version of you who could absorb without complaint, employers, perhaps, who rewarded the version of you who gave more than was asked and then gave more again. When you cease to be that version, the architecture begins to shift. Some of it holds, some of it does not. The parts that do not hold were never truly structural. They were held together by the constant effort of your self-abandonment, and when the effort stops, they fall. What remains after the falling is what was actually yours to begin with. But there is a period, sometimes a long one, in which more seems to be falling than remaining, and in that period your mind will offer you the old explanations, that you were wrong to change, that you should go back, that whatever you have now is not worth what you have lost. None of this is true. All of it will be persuasive. The capacity to hear these voices and not obey them is the capacity that is, at this moment, being forged in you. The period you are entering now, or may already be standing inside without yet recognizing it, is the one that is almost never described accurately in anything you will read about becoming yourself. It is the quiet phase. It does not resemble anything you might have been promised by those who speak of awakening as if it were a graduation. There is no arrival, there is no triumph, there is, instead, a strange and disquieting stillness, a span of weeks or months or sometimes years in which life becomes oddly muted, in which the old relationships have either ended or thinned to a neutral courtesy, in which the people who once filled your calendar with their needs have drifted to find other vessels, in which the phone is quiet in a way that the phone has never been quiet before, and in which the person you thought you would be, once you were finally free, has not yet appeared. You are in an interval, and intervals in the life of the psyche are the most misunderstood territory of all. What is happening during this stillness is not nothing. It only resembles nothing because the activity is occurring below the level at which you are accustomed to measuring your life. For most of your existence, the evidence of your aliveness has been external. You knew you mattered because someone called. You knew you were loved because someone needed. You knew you existed because you were reflected constantly in the responses of the people whose emotional weather you were regulating. When those reflections stop, the sensation is not liberation. The sensation, at first, is something close to annihilation, not dramatic annihilation, nothing so cinematic, a quiet, ordinary erasure in which you go through your days and wonder with mild alarm whether you have become invisible, whether something essential has leaked out of your life, whether the person you were was only ever the sum of the services you provided, and whether, now that the services have stopped, there is anyone left underneath. There is, but she or he is very new, or rather, very old, and only now being allowed to come forward, and the process by which this person emerges is not a process of building, it is a process of settling the sediment of your actual self, which has been kept in suspension by the constant stirring of your caretaking reflex, is finally being allowed to settle to the bottom, where it can form, over time, into a ground you can stand on. This settling cannot be hurried. It resists your attempts to make it productive. You will want, during this period, to fill the silence with a new project, a new relationship, a new version of yourself that has at least the dignity of appearing to be someone. Every part of your nervous system will argue that something must be done, that this emptiness is a mistake, that a life without the constant traffic of other people's feelings must be defective in some fundamental way. These arguments are not truths. They are the protests of a system that is losing its familiar occupation. And like any system that is losing what it has long depended on, it is generating signals of emergency in order to persuade you to restore the old configuration. You will feel, at moments, a sharp and almost punitive loneliness, not the loneliness of being without company, something more specific. The loneliness of no longer being accompanied by the particular kind of attention you have been accompanied by for most of your life. You will realize, if you let yourself, that the presence you always felt with others was not quite their presence. It was the presence of your attunement to them. You were always with them in the sense that part of you was continuously engaged in tracking their state, reading their mood, preparing for their reaction. When you stop tracking, they are, in some sense, no longer there, even when they are physically in the room, because the relationship you had with them was largely a relationship with your own vigilance. This is a painful recognition. It means that many of your closest bonds were not quite what you believed them to be. They were, in part, bonds with a version of you that has now gone offline, and the people on the other end are not able to locate you anymore. Because the you they knew was a surface you maintained for their comfort. Beneath that surface, they never reached, and you, being unable to locate yourself in the old way, are momentarily lost to both of you. Consider a small scene that may feel familiar. You are sitting at a dinner with old friends. In the old days, you would have been working the whole time, not consciously, but working, adjusting your expression to keep everyone at ease, noticing who had not spoken and directing a question toward them, sensing the tension rising between two people at the other end of the table and diffusing it with a well-placed story, laughing at the joke that was not quite funny because the person who told it needed to feel appreciated, absorbing the irritation of the one who was having a difficult week, holding the whole weather of the table in your chest without ever letting anyone see the weight of it. That night, you would have gone home exhausted, and you would have called it a good evening, because everyone else had enjoyed themselves, and their enjoyment was, in the private economy of your psyche, the proof that you had been worth inviting. Now imagine yourself at the same dinner, a year or two into the quiet phase. You are present, you are warm, but the work is not happening. You are not scanning, you are not managing, you are simply sitting, eating, listening to what is actually being said, rather than to what is being transmitted beneath it. The conversations around you seem stranger than they used to, less interesting. The jokes land less well. The tensions you used to diffuse either resolve themselves or do not. And you find, to your own surprise, that you are not compelled to intervene. You go home that evening less exhausted but strangely disoriented. Something was missing. What was missing was you as the emotional scaffolding of the gathering. And without you in that role, the gathering was simply what it was, which may or may not have been much. This is one of the small, uncomfortable realizations that accumulate during the quiet phase, that some of your relationships were sustained almost entirely by your labor, that when you stop laboring, they reveal their actual dimensions, which are sometimes smaller than you had believed, sometimes transactional in ways you had not let yourself see, sometimes contingent on a performance you can no longer bear to give. This is not cynicism. It is not the hardening of the heart. It is the simple clarity that arrives when a distorting lens is removed from your vision. You begin to see people as they are rather than as your attunement had constructed them. Some of them become smaller. Some of them, unexpectedly, become larger because the ones who were actually meeting you, rather than being managed by you, remain present in a way that does not require your ongoing maintenance. And you discover that there are fewer of these people than you once believed, and more of the other kind. And this discovery is one of the quiet griefs of this period, a grief that cannot be shared with the people you are grieving, because they would not recognize the portrait you are forming of them any more than you would have recognized it a year ago. What makes this grief bearable is not consolation. There is no consolation available, and any that is offered will ring false. What makes it bearable is the slow accumulation of weight in your interior. You are becoming, imperceptibly, a person with a center of gravity. For most of your life, your center of gravity was not inside you. It was distributed across the people whose emotional states you were monitoring. Your stability depended on their stability. Your mood was an average of the moods in your immediate vicinity. You could not tell, much of the time, which feelings were yours and which had simply drifted in from someone nearby and taken up temporary residence in your body. Now, as you stop participating in the constant transfer, something begins to coalesce in the middle of you, a place that is only yours, a place where your feelings are your own, your thoughts are your own, your reactions are your own, and the feelings of others, however loud, do not automatically become yours by virtue of their proximity. This coalescing is what other people will eventually sense, if they are capable of sensing it. As you wait, you will be described, perhaps, as grounded, or as having become quieter in a way that is hard to name. Some people will be drawn to this new density, others will be repelled by it, because density of this kind reveals, by contrast, the absence of density in those who encounter it. A person who has not yet begun to gather herself finds it unsettling to stand near a person who has something. In the unsettling is envy, though it will never admit itself as envy. Something is fear, the fear of what such a gathering might require of them if they were ever to undertake it, and something is simply the disturbance that any centered object causes in a field that has been rearranging itself for years around your decentered presence. You are no longer available to be rearranged. You are, finally, at rest in a particular place, and this rest is experienced by the unresting as provocation. Although no provocation is being offered, you are simply there, present, weighted, no longer rising to the bait of emotional drafts that used to move you around the room at will. There is a particular kind of projection that will intensify during this period, and it is worth naming directly, because if you do not see it for what it is, you may mistake it for a truth about yourself. The people who have lost their access to your emotional labor will begin, in some cases, to experience you as the source of their disturbance. They will speak of you to themselves, and sometimes to others, as if you had become the problem. You have become selfish, you have become arrogant, you have become distant, difficult, unrecognizable. You have changed in ways they cannot endorse. What is actually happening is that they are experiencing the return of their own unprocessed material. And because they cannot locate it inside themselves, they are locating it outside themselves. In you, because you are the most recent person whose changed behavior coincided with their discomfort. This is projection in its most ordinary form. It is not a sophisticated maneuver, it is the default operation of a psyche that cannot yet bear its own contents. The contents are pushed outward and attributed to whoever is closest, and you are closest because you used to absorb them. When you are the recipient of this projection, the temptation to refute it is enormous. You will want to explain, you will want to demonstrate with examples and evidence that you have not become the things they are saying you have become. You will want to prove that you are still the person you have always been, only a little freer, a little more rested, a little more your own. This explanation will not work. It cannot work. You are not being accused. In the precise sense, you are being used as a container for something the accuser cannot hold. And containers do not talk their way out of being containers by speaking eloquently about themselves. The only thing that ends projection is the recovery. By the projector of the material they have been externalizing, that recovery is not yours to perform. You cannot perform it for them. You could not even begin to. What you can do, and what the quiet phase is gradually teaching you to do, is refuse to accept the projection as a description of your reality. You can listen to it without internalizing it. You can hear the words without letting them enter the place in you where, before, such words would have immediately become beliefs. This is one of the strangest capacities that develops in this period. The capacity to hear yourself described in ways that are not accurate and to remain underneath the description, unchanged, for most of your life. Other people's descriptions of you functioned as mirrors, and you took your shape from what you saw in them. If they told you you were selfish, you became anxious about your selfishness and began to work harder to prove you were not. If they told you you were cold, you warmed yourself performatively at cost to yourself to disprove the charge. If they told you you were too much, you became smaller. If they told you you were not enough, you became more. Your shape was infinitely deformable, because the mirror was always outside you, and whatever shape the mirror reported, you became. The new capacity is the capacity to hear the report and notice that it does not match the territory, and to return to the territory rather than to the report. You are no longer infinitely deformable. You have acquired, finally, a shape that persists under pressure. This does not mean you are rigid. You are still responsive. You still hear. You still reflect. But the reflection no longer reaches into the core of you and rearranges what is there. The core is settled, and the settling of that core is what begins, very gradually, to make the quiet phase feel less like an absence and more like a preparation. You are not waiting for nothing. You are waiting for the version of yourself that can only emerge once the old version has finished dying, and the old version cannot finish dying while it is still being asked to perform. The silence is giving it permission to die. The loneliness, unbearable as it sometimes is the exact condition required for the next thing to form, and the next thing is not an improvement on the old self. It is not a more impressive version of the person who used to carry everyone's weight. It is a different order of being altogether, one whose shape is only now beginning to be perceptible to you in moments as you sit in your quiet kitchen or walk to your quiet car or lie in your quiet bed at night and realize with something that is not yet peace but is adjacent to it that you are, for the first time in living memory, alone in a way that is not a catastrophe. What is forming in the silence, though you cannot yet describe it and could not name it if you were asked, is the actual structure of your own authority, not authority over others. That is a different thing, and a lesser one. What is forming is authority within yourself, the quiet and unshakable capacity to know what you think, what you feel, what you want, what you will and will not tolerate, without requiring external confirmation that these knowings are valid. For most of your life, your inner life operated by a different mechanism. You would feel something, and before the feeling could fully register, and the second process would begin, in which you would check the feeling against the likely responses of the people around you, adjust it for acceptability, soften its edges, question its legitimacy, and eventually present to yourself a version of your feeling that had already been edited for external consumption. You did this so quickly and so automatically that you did not know you were doing it. You believed the edited version was your feeling. You believed the adjusted thought was your thought. You had no access to what you actually felt or thought because the editing happened beneath the threshold of your awareness, and by the time consciousness arrived, the material had already been pre-approved. What is changing now is that the editing mechanism is slowing down. Feelings are arriving in you and lingering in their original form long enough for you to meet them before they are altered. Thoughts are occurring and remaining intact rather than being immediately translated into something more palatable. You are discovering, sometimes with surprise and sometimes with dismay, that you have opinions you did not know you had, preferences that do not match the ones you have been performing, irritations you had not permitted yourself to acknowledge, affections that were never allowed to surface because they would have complicated the arrangement. This is what was meant in the older language by the return of the shadow, though the word has been so overused that it has lost most of its precision. The shadow is not some dark and dangerous thing. The shadow is simply the sum of what you were not permitted to be. And when the prohibitions that held it back begin to dissolve, it returns not as a monster, but as the ordinary material of your own person that was banished in the service of the role you were playing, your honest anger, your honest desire, your honest boredom with people you were supposed to find fascinating your honest indifference to causes you were supposed to care about, your honest attractions, aversion, hungers, refusals. None of these are dark, they are only dark by contrast to the bright and curated self you presented for so long. As these return to you, they bring with them a peculiar sensation that you may at first mistake for coldness. It is not coldness. You have been conditioned to believe that warmth consists of the continuous outflow of your energy toward others, and that any cessation of outflow is therefore a withdrawal of warmth. This is false. What you have been providing for most of your life was not warmth, it was heat generated by the friction of your self-abandonment. And heat of that kind burns the one who produces it, while offering only a brief and hungry comfort to the one who receives it. Real warmth is different. Real warmth is the radiance of a person who is in possession of herself, who is not depleting in order to give, who offers what she offers because she has it to offer, and not because she is performing a contract. She never signed. This kind of warmth is slower, it is less visible, it does not fill a room the way the old warmth did, because the old warmth was the warmth of someone burning, and burning is always dramatic. The new warmth is the warmth of something that is simply lit from within and does not need to prove its own illumination. People who knew you in the old configuration may experience this new warmth as an absence. They are not entirely wrong. The old warmth is absent. The old availability is absent. The old inexhaustibility is absent. What is present is something they may not have the capacity to receive, because receiving the radiance of a person in possession of herself requires that the receiver also be, at least partially, in possession of himself. Many of the people in your life have not yet undertaken this possession. They are still looking for the heat of another person's burning, because that is what they have always understood as connection. When you stop burning, they interpret your stillness as rejection, and they cannot hear you when you tell them it is not. There is no argument you can win with someone whose framework does not yet contain the category of the experience you are offering. You can only continue to be what you are becoming, and wait, without expectation, to see who among them gradually develops the capacity to meet you and who does not. This waiting is not lonely in the way the quiet phase was lonely. Something has shifted. You are no longer waiting for anyone to return you to yourself, because you have returned to yourself, and no one can give you what you already have. The waiting now is simply the patience of a person who has found her own ground and is curious, without urgency, about who else will arrive on it. Some will not. The ones who do arrive will be different from the ones who filled your life before, because the filter by which you select your intimates has been reconfigured. You are no longer drawn to the familiar shape of the early wound. You no longer experience the activation of old complexes as chemistry. The people who interest you now are the ones whose presence allows you to remain yourself, not the ones whose presence requires you to disappear. This is a narrower category. There are fewer of them, but the bonds you form with them have a different quality, a quality you have probably not experienced before, and that quality is the quality of being met without having to be altered in order to be meetable. Consider as a final small scene what a phone call looks like now. When it goes well, someone you love calls. Perhaps it is still your mother. Perhaps it is someone else. The particular figure matters less than the structure. She speaks, you listen, you hear what she's saying and also what she is feeling. Because your perceptive capacity has not diminished, it has in fact sharpened, because it is no longer distorted by the need to immediately respond to what you perceive. You feel what she is feeling clearly enough to understand it, but you do not absorb it. Her feeling remains hers. It does not travel into you and install itself in your body. You can be moved by her without being moved into her. You respond when a response is warranted. You do not respond when a response would only serve the old transfer. You say at one point that you are sorry she's going through this. You mean it? You do not say anything that implies you will do anything about it, because the thing it is not yours to do anything about. She pauses, perhaps not knowing quite what to do with this version of the conversation. Then she continues, and the conversation either finds a new form or it does not. And you are equally prepared for either outcome, because your equilibrium is no longer dependent on the form the conversation takes. You hang up the phone. You are not drained. You are also not triumphant. You are simply a person who has had a phone call with another person and who is now going to go about the rest of her day. This is the ordinary miracle of what has happened to you. It is not a conversion. It is not an enlightenment. It is the quiet conclusion of a long process of disentanglement. And what it produces is not a new kind of human being, but the kind of human being you were always supposed to be. Before, the arrangements of your early life required you to be something else. You are not cold. You are not hard. You have not become selfish or arrogant or closed. You have become weighted. You have become bounded. You have become internally aligned in a way that means the same gestures that once cost you your life now cost you nothing, because they are proceeding from abundance rather than from depletion. When you help someone now, the helping does not empty you. When you listen to someone now, the listening does not require your self-erasure. When you love someone now, the love does not demand that you become smaller so that they can remain the shape they have always been. There is one recognition left, and it is the recognition that resolves quietly the guilt that may still rise in you from time to time when someone from the old arrangement looks at you with the wound of your changed presence in their eyes. You have not abandoned them. You have simply stopped participating in a structure that was asking both of you to pretend that what was happening between you was love, when it was in fact a mutual haunting in which their unresolved material was moving through your body and your unresolved material was moving through their choices. And neither of you was really meeting the other at all. What you have done by stepping out of the structure is make room for the possibility that something else might form, something that could actually be called love. Whether that possibility is taken up by them is not in your hands. Some of the people from your old life will over time, to begin to do their own work, and a new form of meeting will become possible with them. Some will not, and you will remain for them, the person who changed, and they will remain for you, the people who could not come along. Neither outcome is a failure. Both are ordinary features of a life in which someone has finally stopped carrying what was not hers to carry. You will know that the integration is reaching some kind of settlement when certain questions stop occurring to you. You will stop asking whether you should call them. You will stop rehearsing explanations. You will stop composing in the corner of your mind the speech you would give if they finally asked you to account for what has happened. That speech has been forming in you for a long time, and you may still notice its presence as a faint residue, but one day you will realize that you have not rehearsed it for weeks, and then for months, and then you will realize that you do not actually need to say any of it, to them or to anyone, because the person who needed the speech to be understood was the old you, and the new you does not require that kind of understanding. You are understood by yourself now, and this, it turns out, is the understanding you were always actually seeking. The understanding you sought from them was a substitute. You wanted them to see you because you had not yet learned to see yourself. And now that you have, their seeing has become not unimportant, but no longer necessary for your continuation. What you will feel, in the end, is not joy, though joy will pass through you from time to time. What you will feel is something older and steadier than joy, a kind of upright quiet. You will walk through your days and notice that you are, for want of a better word, present, present to the morning, present to the work, present to the people who remain, present to the people who have gone, present to your own face in the mirror, which is finally the face of the person who lives behind it, rather than the face of the role you were wearing. You will not feel, in this presence, the need to explain yourself. You will not feel the need to justify your choices. You will not feel the need to prove that you have not become someone terrible, because you have not, and the ones who matter will see this. And the ones who cannot see it were never going to see anything, and their inability is not something you are required to correct. There will be moments, even after all of this, when the old pull returns. You will hear that particular note in someone's voice and feel the familiar gathering in your body, and for a second you will almost rise to meet it. You will not always succeed in staying still. You are not performing sovereignty. You are simply becoming it in increments, and increments include the moments when the old pattern briefly reasserts itself. When this happens, you will notice it, which is already different from the old days, when you would have enacted it without noticing at all. You will notice, and you will feel the familiar tension, and sometimes you will rise, and sometimes you will not, and over time, the noticing itself will be enough to slow the reflex and eventually to stop it. There is no final achievement here. There is only the slow, patient accumulation of moments of consciousness in a place that used to be entirely unconscious, and the gradual discovery that consciousness in sufficient quantity is what frees you, not from the pattern, but from the pattern's authority over your life. This is where you are. This is what is happening. You are not going mad. You are not becoming cruel. You are not losing the people who were meant to be in your life. You are losing the people who were in your life because you were not yet in your own. You are gaining in their place a presence that will never leave you because it is you, finally unaccompanied by the roles you were taught to perform in order to be tolerated. The loneliness you feared was the loneliness of having no one. The loneliness that has actually arrived is the loneliness of having, at last, yourself. And that loneliness, which is not really loneliness, is the ground on which everything else, if it is going to come, will come. Nothing else is required of you now. Only that you remain here, in this quiet, upright place, and allow the life that is meant to form around a person in possession of herself to form at its own pace, without your assistance, without your anxiety, without your return to the old labor. You have done enough. You were doing enough when you were doing too much. You are doing enough now. When you are doing almost nothing, you are, at last, enough, not because you have accomplished anything, but because the part of you that was always enough has finally been allowed to come forward and stand quietly in the center of your own life,